Yeah, so we are into Ambedkar today, and one of the features of Indian history and the contemporary Indian historical memory today, in the last couple of decades or so, the resurgence of Ambedkar as a political figure. He was more or less sort of absent from public debates about history, Indian questions of freedom, etc. for a long time after independence. The whole scenario was dominated by Gandhi and Nehru, and subsequently you had the Indo-Pak conflict and Indira Gandhi's dramatic sort of rule, during which the country was put under emergency for 18 months. And other developments kept more or less the focus on the Congress party and its history, right? So, but what happens in the 80s, roughly, beginning in the 80s, but maybe even the 90s more concretely, is that the actually basically after emergency, the Congress consensus begins to break down. Congress is able to hold on to power at the center and in the states for the first few decades successfully until Indira Gandhi, until the emergency. So what happens is there is a good understanding between center and states, because both are ruled by the same party. So this leads to a very strong kind of fortress-like political formation, which after the emergency, with the defeat of the Congress party for the first time in the national elections. Before that, there have been some defeats at the state level. For instance, the communists came to power in Kerala, and the government got dismissed. And another kind of alliance of various parties came to power in another state. But by and large, the Congress system was in place. But after emergency, a new formation, Janata Party, a kind of centrist party which had opposed the emergency, and which had all kinds of people from the left to the extreme right also in the kind of formation that came into existence. Socialists and Hindutva people and other centrist kind of forces, they came to power. And subsequently, so the whole system begins to sort of collapse. That kind of consensus which was a feature of politics before that. And in that process, what happens is a number of regional formations, state level formations. So you have parties coming up like the DMK, which is a kind of Tamil Nadu state party. DMK and its breakaway faction, they become very dominant in one state. The communists become dominant in Kerala and West Bengal, three, four states. And a party of the Sikhs in Punjab, and a party, a new party emerges after a student movement in Assam. And another party in the 80s starts, comes into existence in the Andhra Pradesh state, the state where I currently come from, where there is now a state formation movement going on, and so on. So everywhere you see the regional formations are happening. Along with the regional party formation, there is also a kind of formation of new mobilization of the Dalits happening. And Dalits and other peasant castes is also happening. Now, the Dalit caste, this is around the time when, if you in India, if you travel in India, if you go all over the place, to villages, to small towns and to various places, you will invariably used to find a statue of Gandhi, a statue of Indira Gandhi, or a statue of maybe Nehru, but by and large Gandhi was the most prominent figure. This used to be the case for a long time. Now, if you go now, there are an equal, if not a greater number of these Ambedkar statues. They have completely, come to dominate this the whole landscape, visual landscape, in some kind of amazing kind of development where every slum, they'll set up everything. These are very crudely made statues, not some artistic things. They are just made there locally by some local artist or sculptor or whatever, and painted blue because blue is the color of the Dalit party, and wearing the suit and so on. And so you have this proliferation of these things. So in that way, Ambedkar came into prominence in the popular domain first because of the mobilizations which used Ambedkar as a figure, as the from the past, who was the representative. And the big thing that went in his favor for the Dalits was that he was known as the one who drafted India's constitution. So this was a very, it was a source of great pride for the Dalit communities that somebody who came from their kind of social background, facing discrimination and and living in these kinds of conditions of untouchability and so on, could actually rise to be the drafter of the constitution for the entire country. Those are obviously a sort of great source of pride for the community. And this was, in the beginning, this was exploited by the Congress itself to some extent, saying, after all, the Congress was the one who asked Ambedkar to write the constitution or draft the constitution and so on. But in time, what happens is this leads to a lot of developments. Intellectual circles, Ambedkar's writings begin to be published in the 80s in a systematic way. That is, not just scattered publications, one piece here, one piece there, published by some local publisher, no reprints, not available to read. Many of them, buried in his personal archive or some other place. Then the Maharashtra government, the government of the state where Ambedkar comes from, in the 80s started to publish multi-volume collected writings of Ambedkar. Now this was also another big intellectual event, because for the first time many people outside of the Maharashtra context were reading for the first time. All his things, and many controversial things, because he wrote a critical reviews of Hinduism. He went back to the Sanskrit texts, and that was also another source of great pride, that he actually could read Sanskrit and he could cite Sanskrit shlokas, translate them and say, this is, look at the, what they say. For a Dalit who, Dalits normally are not even allowed to read, I mean, for that matter, nobody other than the Dvija, the high caste, are supposed to read, these kinds of texts. So here was a man who had this erudition, this impressive, fantastic erudition. He had gone to Columbia and he had studied with Dewey, the philosopher, was his teacher. He had gone to London. He had excelled in his academic career. He became a lawyer. He was political, and economic theory. He wrote about financial issues in his dissertations. He passed the bar in London and so on. So in time, this figure led to a consolidation of Dalit political mobilization also. So, and now we have in India, at least in the North India, a party which has been in power in the northern, one of the biggest, most populous states of the North India, Uttar Pradesh, for several times, and it has not much influence outside of that state, but in that state it is a very powerful organization. And there are similar sorts of smaller, less powerful developments, but still influential developments, all of them in some ways using Ambedkar as a kind of iconic figure, right? And Ambedkar thought Of course, inevitably this has led to a certain idealization, right? Ideal. So Ambedkar becomes this, like Gandhi earlier. You can't say anything bad about Gandhi. Nowadays, you can't say anything critical about Ambedkar. This kind of thing was also happening, but it is also the fact that Ambedkar's writings were a discovery. When you read them, you realize how complex his thinking was, how much erudition there was, how much scholarship, how much analytical reasoning that he put to this task of critiquing Hinduism, making a case for Dalit emancipation, and for and appealing to both the Congress on the one hand and the British on the other hand, struggling to find political space for the Dalits and their demands, right? So, so inevitably what happens is Gandhi was this iconic figure, and now suddenly this new person, this upstart, has come, claiming the equal kind of status in the because the lowest of the low, the masses of India were celebrating him, putting up these statues, and so he actually then becomes a figure who competes with Gandhi for the position of the most powerful national icon, right? And it's an amazing kind of development which happens within that quickly in the 80s, 90s essentially, I would say. And today, as I said, he is established as one of the national icons. And also because of the sharp contrast, and historically they've had many confrontations, Gandhi and Ambedkar, and it makes for great drama. For instance, last week we talked about Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore and Gandhi, the conflict is very on a very different plane. Intellectual. He is an intellectual. He is a poet, and he is this politician. He is a great leader, Mahatma, and he is spiritually oriented, but essentially educational and other kinds of initiatives. So there is there is a confrontation there also, but it doesn't have, unlike that confrontation, this one, because these are both politicians and they are both claiming the right to lead the same group of people. That is, of course, Gandhi is leading the Hindus. Ambedkar's point is that I am the leader of the Dalits, the untouchables of India, the depressed classes as they were called then. But Gandhi says, no, they are my people. I am their leader. So there is this, so it makes for great drama, right? These two powerful figures fighting with each other. And especially, even though at that time, whatever the drama might have been, in retrospect, the drama becomes all the more enhanced because you are now looking at these people in retrospect, you're saying, okay, two such starkly opposed views about everything possible, and two equally powerful figures in terms of mass following. And, so intellectuals are also getting, in the last 10, 15 years, there have been many attempts by intellectuals to see commonality between these two figures, to reconcile Gandhi with Ambedkar. You can write D.R. Nagaraj, Bhikkhu Parekh, I can think of 5, 6 such intellectual sort of scholarly efforts to argue that somehow, in spite of these very stark political differences of opinion on practically everything, there is some underlying unity. And it's personally, I find that exercise extremely contrived because it's very difficult to reconcile those two like that. But still, the fact that they so many people want to do it. Bhikkhu Parekh, after all, is a great scholar of Gandhi and Gandhianism and so on. The fact that they feel the need to do it is a proof, evidence of a certain kind of unsettling of past assumptions. What one thought, and that there was something new that was happening here and so on. And so one of this clip I'm going to show a little later is from a film which exploits this drama and makes it, gives you the visual we'll just see a few minutes of it. This is when Gandhi meets Ambedkar and, to thing. But we'll do that when we get to that part where I want to present this idea. Because apart from this, there are other moments in his life which are of some importance, which we should sort of quickly go over. So here it is here, right? Okay, now just now I don't want to see this, but the text, the notes, sorry, where's, okay, so, and as I have been doing every week, I want to continue to pursue the visual culture dimension of it. Because it's quite interesting, in fact, I had not thought of it as anything but just a supplementary illustration when I started doing this. But as I am doing it, I realize there is a paper there. There is an argument to be made about this entire process. In fact, in this course of these last few weeks, I have come to realize that there is a lot that is. So you can see here Ambedkar in the first photograph, the Western educated suave gentleman in his suit. That's his normal suited sort of look. You'll normally only find that suited look in most representations. Now if you look at the right side, now there is another which is not very commonly available image, but it is a painting, and in this painting you can see it's one historic moment in Ambedkar's political career and in the history of India, where Ambedkar leads the Dalits, about 10,000 people gathered there, to go to this lake which was prohibited for the use of the Dalits. They could not use the water there. I mean, this is true of all wells, common wells in India, that there are wells which are commonly used by village people, except the Dalits. They can't use it. They can't touch the water. It's polluting and so on. This is a general. So what happens is they are either prohibited from coming anywhere near it, or even if they are they are given water, it is given by somebody with maintaining some distance and so on, so that the pollution doesn't happen. So in that kind of a context, many things were going on, like temple entry was another major Congress activity. They would try to go to the temples in the south. There was a Periyar, Ramaswamy Naikar, who organized a temple entry in a place in Kerala on Congress advice, on the advice of Gandhi himself. And of course it turned out to be a big fiasco, because the Congress people didn't actually, they just wanted to do some symbolic thing, because Gandhi told us, we have to do it. And then they wanted to get away. But Periyar, in fact, after his experience with that temple entry movement, leaves the party and starts his own movement. So that's another story, but we are not going into that. But this is that event, and if you can see there, Ambedkar is shown wearing a traditional dhoti, the cloth which is tied, it's unstitched cloth, which is worn in that fashion around the waist and so on, with a coat on top of it. Now again, in terms of what we have been discussing in terms of significance of these costume changes in the national leaders in the last few weeks, we said that there were two kinds of things. One is that in Partha Chatterjee's argument, you had the westernized, highly educated, English educated middle class of Bengal, who found this half naked, very rustic spiritual leader Ramakrishna, and he seemed to somehow represent what they lacked in their lives. So it was a supplementary, complementary kind of relationship. They were westernized and materialistic and modernized and urbanized and so on. He was rustic, earthy. He had a profound wisdom, which is the wisdom of the East and the wisdom of India and so on. And so what they lacked, they found in him, right? And then, as we said, Aurobindo Ghosh and in Gandhi and in Tagore, we find that they are figures who in some ways seem to want to assimilate that other that Ramakrishna was into them, to become themselves a kind of somehow through the costume changes, through the changes in appearance, to reflect an internalization of what was then an external manifestation of wisdom and so on. And so you see that Aurobindo Ghosh develops this spiritual figure. Gandhi then also develops a kind of, goes through many costume changes until he becomes something completely different and completely as far removed from his real social background as possible, which is looking like a peasant from a village somewhere in thing. And similarly, Tagore goes through this again from the westernized look to a certain kind of spirituality, but in his case, we noted that he developed a kind of spiritual, both in terms of costume and generally in terms of what he stood for, something which was new but which was not echoing some existing model. That is, not some Indian guru figure or peasant figure or anything that you say, oh, he wants to look like that or something like that, but some new thing, some new, his outfit itself is indicative of that. And here, as I said, in India, a lot of these people who are in the bureaucracy, for instance, there were the Vishveshwaraya, there was a great engineer bureaucrat called Vishveshwaraya. He would wear a suit and a very Indian style turban. C.V. Raman, the great scientist, Nobel Prize winner, he would wear exactly that kind of thing and a turban. So now these are different in the sense that they are evolved out of a sense of your social standing in society, who you are, and the idea that this is the way that gentlemen should dress. So it's that kind of a logic that is operating there. And here I think Ambedkar in this particular costume is actually going for that kind of a thing, an elder, a gentleman within a rural context, rather than an Indianizing look of his look. Now here you can see a very popular calendar kind of figure in which Ambedkar in his suit is juxtaposed with Buddha. That's again is part of Ambedkar's history. He converted to Buddhism late in his life, in fact a few weeks before his death. But he had been proposing to do, even in this text he says, I'm going to be leaving. And in another place he says, I was born a Hindu, there was nothing I could do about it, but if I can help it, I'm not going to die one, and so on. So therefore the Buddha reference becomes another source of great unifying force for the Dalit mobilization. And here is Ambedkar again with the national flag. This goes with his constitution making sort of role in Indian history, and again a popular calendar image, right? Well, the Marathi is not showing, but never mind. So Ambedkar, 1891 to 1956, a short life. Mahars, and one of the things is that there is something unusual about, socially speaking, about Ambedkar. He is not like all the general image of untouchable castes that you have, because in his family, his father, grandfather and others, several generations have served in the military, in the army of the East India Company. Now this obviously makes for a great difference in terms of self, perception of who you are and so on. So there is a certain way in which the biographies talk about the father's sort of interest in education and his ability, because he is constantly in the company of this East India Company sort of milieu, right? That milieu creates a certain kind of sense of freedom and a confidence, which obviously made a big difference to how his children were raised. And but at the same time, you must realize that in spite of that, it was not a very it's not like a cushy life. It was, out of some 14 children, only 5 or 6 survived, and only Ambedkar actually is educated to this extent out of this family. Belongs to the state of Maharashtra, although he was born in a place which is currently in Madhya Pradesh, as another state, neighboring state. And he's doing well in school, and there's also a lot of the Brahmin teachers who were helpful to Ambedkar in his student days, right? So for instance, here it's a Brahmin teacher who asks him to change his name to Ambedkar, and later when he's doing very well in school and he's getting scholarships, it's another Brahmin teacher who gives him a biography of the Buddha and says that you should read it and so on. So
explain why they suggest Ambedkar by the Brahmin teacher. In Maratha, Kar means Brahmin. This is one of the...
No, Kar doesn't mean Brahmin. Kar means belonging to a place.
Yeah. But then Tendulkar, Tarwarkar...
Yeah, because that means...
The conception of the...
No. Kar is just belonging to a place. So Ambavad is the place. Ambedkar means somebody who belongs to that place. That is not the thing, but he is naming him, in that way. It's not to make him sound like a Brahmin. No, and there is no such, it's not a conspiracy kind of thing. It's just some gesture. Some teacher who decided to. Anyway, so he goes. He gets an employee in Baroda. Now, Baroda state is ruled by Sayaji Rao. One of the interesting things about Indian in British, the colonial period is, some of these princely states, there are these kings who are still ruling small things here and there, kingdoms. Some of them are very progressive. Some of them, independently of British India, have adopted progressive measures for doing something about the social composition, the modern ideas, and so on, right? Sayaji Rao is one of the most exemplary of such figures. He offered special scholarships to the disadvantaged people, and so on. Kolhapur, who will also feature here, is another. Mysore is another, and so on. There's many. And Vijayanagaram in the Andhra region is another. All very open-minded people who encouraged. Of course, it's not that they retained their feudal monarchic privileges, but there was this aspect to their functioning. So in Baroda, he finds employment, and Baroda, the Gaikwad, the king, also provides a scholarship which allows Ambedkar to go to the United States to study at Columbia. And so on. We already went through that. And then from Columbia, he lands up in London and gets a law degree and writes another dissertation at LSE. And he goes back to work for the Baroda government. And this is where there's an incident which I have not put in these notes, where he is working for this Baroda government. He has all these kind of achievements behind him, and he finds he rents a place in Baroda to live, and of course, because he is such a westernized person, and he has all this American and British education, the landlord doesn't ask any questions. He just gives it to him, rent. It's a great man who is working for the Baroda state. It gives it to him. After some time, he figures out that he is Dalit caste and asks him to leave. So these kinds of things that you have, you reached such great heights of achievement, and still your caste doesn't let go of you. So at that time he gets disillusioned and leaves. Then he works in a college. Then he goes back to England because he hasn't completed his studies. And the Maharaja of Kolhapur is another progressive ruler who helps him. And then he is back in India. In India, he has now a great sort of reputation because he is, after all, all these achievements. So the British government recognizes him as an important, person of with great education, right? Separate electorates and so one of the things that's happening in India at that time is minorities are asking for separate electorates. They are saying, because the British are slowly introducing in a very restricted form, they are introducing some kind of electoral procedures, where Indians can stand for elections in restricted constituencies and participate in governance in a limited way. They didn't have many powers. They could sit and debate, but finally, if whatever the decision they took, the viceroy can say nothing doing, cancel the things, right? So it's that kind of a situation, but it is still something, beginning. So it was going to be expanded over time. So at that time, what happens is that minorities, and especially the Muslim minority, demand separate electorates. They say you can't elect one common people for all the communities. That's not, they will not represent us the way we want to be represented. So they want separate electorate. Now, Ambedkar wants Dalits also to be recognized in the same way as the Muslims or the Anglo-Indians or other groups, and given separate electorate. Now, this is a bone of contention. This is where it's a highly, for suddenly, the Hindu community begins to form itself, which never in some ways existed, because the Hindu community's whole idea of relating to the Dalit is by exclusion. What you are is what they are not. What they are is what you are not. That kind of. But here the new dynamics, modern nation state formation kind of thing is beginning to, the logic of modern nations is beginning to tell. This logic is an inclusive logic, that is land and everything inside it. Not my community and everything else is outside, that kind of a thing. No. The territorial imaginary begins to play a role here. And so, you suddenly, the population, how many people are Hindus, how many are Muslims in these kinds of calculations, right? So, the question of separate electorates for Dalits suddenly poses the threat of the division of Hindu community and reduction in its numbers and disintegration of society, etc. Now suddenly, people who were never considered to be Hindu in that sense in the past are becoming part of a different type of conception of the Hindu community, society. Now here is where the big tension is in Indian history at that point of time, and continues in some ways in different forms, is in this question of whether Dalits are like Muslims, a separate community from the Hindus, or whether Dalits are part of the Hindu community and therefore not separate. So this is where Ambedkar comes into the picture. This is where the whole drama between Gandhi and Ambedkar, Congress and the depressed class movement, sort of plays out in the 30s and 40s, basically throughout the high points of Ambedkar's career. But meanwhile, he has done other things. He started a paper, Muknayak, Leader of the Silent, and he has been speaking and campaigning. He begins earnestly to become a leader of the Dalits here. And it's also here mentioned that the interesting thing is Kolhapur Raja, as I said, a progressive king in the Maharashtra, has breaks the caste conventions and dined, and that is eats together with Ambedkar, which causes great uproar. The Hindus are up in arms, saying, "How can this king do such a thing?" and so on. So you can see that things are uneven. It's a whole lot of things are going on. Some the standard thing is there. Untouchability is practiced everywhere, but there are also these other kinds of people taking initiatives to break those rules, to do something different, to resist such compulsions and so on. And powerful people like the Baroda Maharaja, the Kolhapur Maharaja, etc. Right. So, a society for the welfare of the excluded is among his initiatives, and as I said, the Mahad Satyagraha. You can see that the Satyagraha word, which is introduced by Gandhi, is also used in this case for something which Ambedkar takes, initiates and sort of leads all on his own. But the word Satyagraha has obviously become so popular by that time that everything, it's called Satyagraha. And so there you have Ambedkar, speaking and saying, "We want equal rights in society, we will achieve them while remaining within the Hindu fold." See, this is 1927. At this point he is saying, we will achieve them as far as possible while remaining within the Hindu fold, or if necessary, by kicking away this worthless Hindu identity. So it's not yet decided. He's not saying that Hindu identity is always or was always going to be rejected. At that point, it's like there seems to be an idea that yes, we are within the Hindu fold now, but we don't have to stay here, right? We can get out of it. And it becomes necessary to give up Hinduism. It would no longer be necessary for us to bother about temple entry and thing. And then this is in 1935, this text which we are reading is from 1936, 36, 37, 36. Now, this 30s is a crucial period, and I just want to draw attention to that quotation, which I have already mentioned. Unfortunately for me, I was born a Hindu untouchable. It was beyond my power to prevent that, but I declare that it's within my power to refuse to live under ignoble and humiliating conditions. I solemnly assure you that I will not die a Hindu. Now, this is in 1935. 1927, as we saw, there is certain ambiguity. Hindu, we may remain in Hindu if it works out, but if it doesn't, we'll go. But here it is completely decided, right? So in a matter of 8 years, he's gone from a very moderate position on this question of Hindu or not Hindu to a decisively non-Hindu kind of position. What has happened in between? This is essentially what we need to be talking about, and already this text is prefigured there. But Another important event, which I will now come to, is something that happened a few years before this final statement. In 1932, the British were about to concede Ambedkar's demand for separate electorates. There was what is called the communal award, and it was going to go into legislature and it was going to be passed and be enacted as law. Separate electorates for Dalits, for untouchables. At this point, Gandhi goes on a fast against this provision. And Gandhi has already fasted many times, and Gandhi's whole, it's a weapon in his hands, right? And the whole nation is looking at this phenomenon. Gandhi is fasting, he is going to die, or what will happen to him? Who is this fellow who has come and, who has made our beloved leader go on a fast again? What will be the effect on his health? And this horrible man, and so on. This is the condition situation. Ambedkar is effectively blackmailed, you can say, into agreeing to a change, compromise on that question. So he gives up the separate electorate demand and agrees to Gandhi's formula, which is internal reservations. That is, some seats will be reserved for Dalits candidates within the general seats. But the electorate will be the same, will be joint, not separate. That kind of a thing. So it is one of those moments, and that is where these films, these little clips, I would like to show you, come into the picture. See, before we come to that moment of the fast, this is a scene, a short scene about Gandhi's first meeting with Ambedkar. The first time that they actually meet. Okay. The text is 1936, that is 1932. The second clip is just after they agree to the Pune Pact, and then they meet. So I mean the film is picturizing it as having done it, coming to see and all that, but that's the 32 moment. But the other clip is the first meeting is slightly earlier. I can't remember the date, but before that. Yes. I mean, it's not much before because it's after the roundtable, first roundtable conference, 30. So it's 31, that period. The exact date, yeah. Anyway, so that is essentially the big source of the big conflict. And for Gandhi, one of his missions in life as a Congress leader then becomes, how to keep this whole thing together. The Hindu fold, as he calls it, together. And so you see Gandhi becoming more and more of a anti-untouchability campaigner, far more rigorously, far more, energetically after this stage. Because after this stage, slowly this becomes his dominant concern. Before that, it's there, but it's not, but he now, seeing the threat that, untouchability as a social practice can pose to Hindu unity, Hindu whatever, he begins to take a far more serious interest. And indeed, his, a scholar has traced the changes in Gandhi's position on the Hinduism and untouchability question over a few decades, and it's quite dramatic. So in a way you can attribute that to the influence of Ambedkar on Gandhi's politics, right? Okay. Yeah, so the text that we are dealing with, so if you come to now the text, the annihilation of caste, now this is a text with its own interesting history because it's composed for a conference. Now there is a Hindu outfit called Jat Path Todak Mandal, a very colorful name, which means an association for destroying caste. But what is interesting about that name is it uses a very standard, non-Sanskritic, very everyday, people's language. Jat Path Todak. Jat Path itself is a a repetitive thing, which is not a literary kind of thing, but a colloquialism. This conference, this mandal, which is run by somebody called Santram in Punjab, and in Lahore, which was then in United India, invites Ambedkar to speak at this to them, to their members, and invites him because he has been saying that in order to really destroy caste system, Hindu, it's not enough to point out, have interdining and intercaste marriage and so on, because these are one-off things, it is necessary to question and fundamentally, attack the very basis of caste system, which he thinks is religion. Hindu religion is the base for the caste system, and therefore without destroying the religion you cannot destroy the caste system, and so on. He has been saying a few things on those lines, and he has also been saying how he wants to quit Hinduism and become he join some other religion. Conversions are already going on to some small extent, Muslim conversion to Islam, conversion to Christianity, of course, has been going on since the 19th century or even before, and so on. But he is taking it as a more seriously political question, and so this outfit is interested in his ideas, so they call him. But as the initial correspondence, which is reproduced by Ambedkar, shows his references, some of his references to the fact that he wants to, that the religion has to be destroyed, the Vedas, Upanishads, and all the sanctity of these texts has to be challenged, and so on. Ambedkar goes over this whole thing, because they suddenly say, no, we can't have this, can you change that, and he says, but when you ask me to preside over this function, and it is the duty of a president to give his views and lead, in a leadership role. It's supposed to be a leadership role. How can you censor my thing, and so on. And in fact, Gandhi, in his reply later, in fact defends Ambedkar's position, saying if you called him as a president, you should let him speak. And so he finds fault with the Mandal. But essentially, having gone is, why is it that first you knew it and then you pretend that you didn't know that I was going to say this, whereas your own president, Santaram, your leader, in his own letters has told me that he wants to hear what I have to say on precisely this question, and he very well knew my position, and so on. And finally, he comes to this reading saying, what is the exact reason for this last minute change in your decision? And he says that just a couple of weeks before the event in Lahore, he had gone to Amritsar to attend a Sikh conference. Now, this was an interesting moment. The Sikhs were like the Muslims. The Sikhs also had asked for and got separate electorates and reservations in other things. Now, Ambedkar was exploring the possibility of conversion to Sikhism as an option for the Dalits. But he gives up the idea because the British government says new converts to Sikhism will not be enjoy these benefits which are available. So if you are in Maharashtra, Dalits of Maharashtra, and you say I have converted to Sikhism, you are not going to get the benefits that have been given to the Sikhs of Punjab. So this conversion is not going to make a difference to that. So Ambedkar gives up on that. Ambedkar is exploring, he does not want conversion to Islam because he knows that that is a religion which has come from outside, and therefore the decision to convert to Islam will give rise to the hostility, great hostilities and so on, and he has his own, whatever reasons for not wanting. He wants it to be a religion which is not Hindu, but has its origins in the Indian subcontinent. That is correct. That's why the Sikhism first and then Buddhism. Now Ambedkar figures that it's because he went to that conference and tried to make some, explore possibilities with the Sikhs, that these people have got, pissed off with him and want to now cancel the thing. Anyway, that's the background to it. And the text itself, as we look at it, he starts of course by congratulating and then he says, so to many a Hindu, he, that is Gandhi, is an oracle so great that when he opens his lips, it is expected that the argument must close and no dog must bark. But the world owes much to rebels who would dare to argue in the face of the pontiff and insist that he is not infallible. I do not care for the credit which every progressive society must give to its rebels. I shall be satisfied if I make the Hindus realize that they are the sick men of India and that their sickness is causing danger to the health and happiness of other Indians. Later on in this essay, he will say that it is causing danger to the health and happiness of Hindus also, not just the others, right? Right. Okay. So the essential arguments of this paper, which we can sum up, quickly, is, as I think, as we in talking about Ambedkar, we noted that one of the fundamental differences that was a feature of the national movement, which divided different people from each other. One of the fundamental differences is about the political and the social. Right? Now, that is, do we need political welfare or social welfare, or political change or social change, political freedom or social emancipation? That is not just that whether we need, but which has the priority. This is a fundamental question. Rabindranath Tagore differs with Gandhi on precisely this question. Rabindranath Tagore's whole point is that the people of India are not even in a position to ask for freedom. How can you simply ask for political freedom? Because if you ask for political freedom, you are asking for yourself, but you are claiming that it's for them. But they are not, they are already enslaved by the caste system and other ills of society, and so you are saying you will get a freedom. They are not even aware of that there is such a freedom, that they are in bondage to the British, because the bondage that they are actually experiencing is the bondage of caste and the bondage of the zamindari system and all internal things. That is what they everyday experience. But you are telling them you will get freedom, which is freedom from British rule, which is, what difference does it make to me, right? So they are not educated, they are completely illiterate, they are their lives are completely dominated by hard work and misery and impoverishment and starvation and other kinds of and superstition and so on. And so, as we saw, Rabindranath Tagore proposes that you have to first start at the village level, educate, constitute village councils, and then build up to the provinces, and from the provinces you come together as provinces, having taken care of your interior social questions, to constitute what he calls the center, right? Ambedkar is arguing the same thing. We saw that Ranade was cited by M.G. Ranade, right? Who was a liberal, a moderate from the 19th century, who wrote a work of history which is even now read, which is Rise of the Maratha Power, and on education. Ambedkar's point is similar to that of Tagore. He says social and political. The question of political freedom without social emancipation, he says, is completely absurd. It is completely, goes against any reason. So you come to power. So he says, you come to power tomorrow, having gained political freedom. Are you going to treat? Is the caste system going to completely disappear tomorrow? It's not going to. So there will be new leaders in the political domain, but they will continue to do what they have been doing all along, right? Because that level they do not want change, right? That is the first point. Political versus social. Now the second point is, of course, by then there is the whole socialist challenge, right? The socialists have arrived on the scene, and they are saying all this caste and all these things, they are not real problems. They are superficial problems. The economy is the real source of all problems. You change the economic structure, caste will disappear by itself. We are familiar with that argument. It's made in many places. Against that argument, Ambedkar argues that it cannot be the case that the economy will, economic change will automatically lead to social change. That is, he takes up the whole question. So you say proletarian revolution. So the proletarians will take power, but are the proletarians, is there solidarity among the proletarians? No, they are divided by caste. So there are working class people, but some of them are upper caste, some of them are lower caste, and while they are working together, they will observe the same caste, prohibitions, rules and regulations. So just because they come to power, they are not going to immediately change and say, oh, you are my brother, right? They are going to continue to have the same thing and so on. That's his argument. You can see that quotation from W.C. Banerjee. This is a Banerjee who was so anglicized that he used to call himself Bonerjee.
The spelling is also W.
Right. So he says, this Bonerjee says, I for one have no patience with those who say we shall not be fit for political reform until we reform our social system. I fail to see any connection between the two. Are we not fit for political reform because our widows remain unmarried and our girls are given in marriage earlier than in other countries? The answer is yes, you are not fit. But anyway, he thinks that the answer is no. Are we not fit because our wives and daughters do not drive about with us visiting our friends, because we do not send our daughters to. So this is the idea that we want political freedom, and we don't want you to talk about the fact that children get married and become widows at the age of 8 or 9, or that they remain unmarried afterwards for the rest of their lives. All that is not your concern. Untouchability, not your concern. Political freedom is what we want. That's the thing about. He gives the whole history of untouchability from Maharashtra, where the Maratha Empire and followed by Peshwa rule. The Peshwa was a Brahmin kingdom, where untouchability was at its worst, possibly. The only other comparable practice of untouchability is in Kerala, where severe restrictions, where shadows are polluting. The person's shadow is polluting. The person has to wear a pot around his neck so that they spit into the pot, because they should not spit on the road and pollute the road. And the person has to sweep after walking, because his footsteps should not be seen by others, and so on. You can't even begin to imagine the kind of. And then he gives more examples, where villagers say that these are also very commonly used to be heard very commonly. Untouchables should not wear footwear. You should not wear chappals. Untouchables cannot wear jewelry. Untouchables cannot wear fancy clothes, and so on and so forth. So he gives you this whole history of. And then he turns Banerjee's rhetorical strategy against him. He says, are you fit for political power even though you do not allow a large class of your own countrymen to use public schools? Are you fit for political power even though you do not allow them to use public wells? Are you fit for political power even though you do not allow them use of public streets, and so on? So it shows the thing that such a community cannot be fit for political power, which they are asking for, right? And he shares this social conference. That is, people like Ranade were part of the social conference. That was the other outfit. There was the Congress and there was the Indian Social Conference. The social conference was of the opinion that the British, as we saw with Tagore, that the British have brought some new ideas. Their ideas are good for us. We should transform our society and emancipate ourselves and give up all these bad practices and so on. And so they are enthusiastic about the reforms that they feel they should conduct in their own society. So the Congress and the social reformists are at loggerheads. They don't agree with each other, and in time the social conference just disappears, because they are not as powerful as the Congress. The Congress is much more with its political freedom argument, because the Congress doesn't insist on social reform. It's more popular, right? And he also gives you this Roman example. Now, anyway, critique of the socialists. Critique of the socialists is that the economic interpretation cannot be. This is an interesting point, because one question one could pose is, what is Ambedkar's theory of ideology? Because in some ways, when he talks about the plebeians and patricians of Rome, he is saying, essentially, he is saying that plebeians had the right to elect their own consul and send that consul to the republic's administration, right? But he says what actually happened was that the election had to be endorsed by the oracle, the goddess in the temple, and the goddess in the temple was a patrician supporter. So the goddess would say, no, this person is not good. If the person elected by the plebeians was a very strong, radical person, then the oracle would say, no, this is not a suitable person. So then they would have to re-elect, and so only somebody who is moderate and willing to listen to the patricians would be selected to represent the consuls. Now, if you look at that, it seems like he is making conspiracy theory there, that the patricians were conspiring, that ideology is conspiracy. But later on we will see that he is actually not using a conspiratorial theory of ideology. In this part he is. In this part, because the oracle is obviously a plant, you just put your own person in the goddess's position and you make her say yes or no according to the interest. But later certain things that Ambedkar is saying in this essay indicate that he has a more complex theory of ideology. So it's not clear whether this is just that he contradicted himself within the same essay, or whether he thinks that in the Roman case that was actually the case. I don't know. We can discuss that. So the oracle is shared, and therefore the oracle's word has to be followed. That is the crucial thing. So he articulates the theory of ideology, but it carries the connotation of a deception, as if the people are being deceived. Power, right. So the proletarian revolution comes next. So if the working class sees power, it seems that, unless you have a feeling of equality and fraternity among the proletariat, this kind of revolution cannot succeed. And clearly we don't have that kind of unity, right? No such deeper spirit prevails among the proletarian classes in India. They are as divided by caste and creed as the other classes, and there is no perception of a fundamental division between rich and poor. That is, we don't have this idea that we are all poor and they are all rich, and so it's our fight against them. That sense that will never, we can never prevail because of the interference of the caste system, right? So in that way he dismisses the arguments of the economy, the socialists. So he says, even after the revolution, even if you don't do it before, you will have to confront the caste question afterwards. And as for the defenders of caste, he says the division of labor argument is a spurious one, because division of labor is based on capacity. You do this work, I do that work, that kind of thing. But this is a permanent division based on birth, and therefore it cannot be said that division of labor is what is at the back of the caste system. And biological argument is, that race question, again dismissed. What caste has done to India? It has demoralized and disorganized the Hindus. See, the Hindus are also affected in that sense. There is no such thing as a Hindu society because of caste. And that is, there a collection of castes. So nobody feels, okay, I am this caste and you are that caste, but we are all one after all. There is no such thing. There is no supplementary unity. There is no fundamental unity, but there is not even a supplementary unity saying over and above our caste things we are one. No, there is nothing like that. Not a society or a nation. Similarity of customs, beliefs, etc. is not enough to make a society. It has to have something in common, to possess something in common. And it talks about communication in that context. Be able to communicate in common. So the anti-social spirit, that is, he goes into the question of how the tribal populations have remained uncivilized, and I think this is one of the controversial topics, because the tribal populations today would not take kindly to these observations of Ambedkar, who is saying that they are uncivilized and they needed to be civilized, and why have they not been civilized, etc. Right? But he is also a figure in his own historical moment. So he has some of the prejudices of the generally prevailing prejudices of that time. And for instance, even on the question of eugenics, Ambedkar thinks that there can be a good eugenics. In this essay, you have a moment when he says that the eugenic argument could be used in a positive way, but that's not being used, and so on. So the Hindus do not like it when other people imitate them. So when the Sonars started to adopt the dress and speech of the Brahmins, they were told no, it was banned, and so on. These kinds of examples of the Hindu tendency to keep people at bay, don't do what we do. And then he says, this Arya Samaj, tries to build something, and it is not a bad thing, but it's not possible. This Shuddhi is not possible because of the birth criterion, right? And so missionary activity is not possible now, because missionary activity is only possible if you say, I want everybody to be part of my community. But you don't want that. That's the essence of Hindu in the caste system, is that you don't want that. Right. Excommunication is a threat. Threat of excommunication exists at all times. All these virtues of human existence, the kindness, charity, loyalty, sympathy, all of these things are restricted to your own caste community. There is no, well, this is the same argument. On the Arya Samaj, he actually says, Arya Samajists are actually talking about Varna system in a different way, which is not a bad way, if it were actually possible. But this division cannot be maintained. He gives the example of Shambhuka, which is a story from the Ramayana, where Rama kills Shambhuka because he is a Shudra who is trying to be a Brahmin. He was doing tapas, penance. Right. So caste is there among non-Hindus also, but then he says it cannot be taken as to say that after all it's there among Muslims, it's there among Christians. But the fact is that even though it is there, the discourse of Christianity or the discourse of Islam doesn't say that it should be there. It is there in a practical way, but the doctrine doesn't approve of it, right? Nobody will say we want caste, Islam is all about caste, Varnashrama, separate division. They will say we are all equal, even though in practice they may be discriminating and so on. So it is a practical anomaly which is not reflected in the doctrine. Whereas in the Hindu case, the doctrine itself actually recommends these divisions. What is to be done? So on the question of what is to be done, how to bring about reform, that's where he says, it says interdining, that is eating together, sitting and eating together is not a big step. Intermarriage may be effective, but then it's not possible. And therefore he comes to this view that religion, only by attacking the Shastras, that is the holy texts of Hinduism, and by destroying the belief in their sanctity, can caste be destroyed. So reformers working for the removal of untouchability, including Mahatma Gandhi, do not seem to realize that the acts of the people are merely the results of their beliefs inculcated upon their minds by the Shastras, and that people will not change the conduct until they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras on which their conduct is founded. Religion as ideology. You see, religion as ideology comes here in the sense that it's a different idea. He says, he gives the example of a Hindu who will not take a menial job because his caste doesn't allow him. Now that is a good example to show that ideology affects him as much as the lower caste person, right? He suffers as a result of his own caste assumptions. So this is a different theory of ideology at work here. Whereas in that Roman plebeian patrician thing, it was like a cheating, deception type of thing. Here, it seems the high and the low are both subject to the same ideological framework. Right? Right. So he says religion, destroying the religious the basis, that in questioning the Shastras and pointing out that the Shastras are actually just frozen texts of law, that they are all laws, they are not revelations, they are not God's things, they are just laws which were followed by people in those days which have become holy through survival. And so what he is saying is, and this is again something we need to discuss, we can discuss after taking a short break, is what is his solution to the caste question finally in this text. Because finally he is saying you must make people realize that these are all just laws, right? Hindu religion is, this is what Hindu religion is not a set of universal principles but laws. Dharma is a set of injunctions to be found in the texts, a set of ordinances, legalized class ethics. So this is his reading, that they are just laws which have congealed and frozen and become somehow holy. People think that it's some revelation that God said these are the things. So he says the misnaming of law as religion must be unmasked. The false religion must be abandoned. And then, this is a quotation, this is an essential step for you. That is, Ambedkar is telling the Hindus, this essential step for you is to realize that what you think of is religion is actually just a few laws. His argument is that mistaking laws for religious ideas is the root of the problem, and the solution to the problem is to realize, that is, to come to know that they are merely laws. These terms are used, looking upon, association of ideas, coming to know, etc. If you come to know that the laws are actually posing as religion, then you will be free. Now that's again, the question of what kind of solution is it actually, right? And then he, of course, gives this advice. There should be, that Hindus should have only one sacred book. They should abolish the priesthood or make it hereditary. Priests should be appointed by government and other kinds of things. Now Gandhi's comment, of course, Gandhi says Varna is, without Varna there is no Hinduism, and I will not let go of it, and so on. So, Ambedkar's response to that, where one of the interesting points in the response is whether Gandhi follows his own belief in Varna system. He says, I believe in the Varna system. People should belong to the caste that they belong to and should do whatever the caste tells you. But he says Gandhi is a Vaishya, and he does the work of what that Brahmins are supposed to do, and so on. He points out the contradictions in that. That in fact there are more Brahmins selling shoes than the chamars and so on, right? So in other words, Varna is not actually practiced. So it's just a statement. So he gives two reasons why the Mahatma speaks like that, even though he knows that even his own life contradicts the Varnashrama. Why does he talk like that? So he says two reasons. One is his childlike innocence, the ability to say whatever he pleases. So tomorrow he will say it's something else. Second thing is that he is both saint and politician, and the politician cannot retain his central position if he does not continue to defend Varna, because the Hindus will get angry with him, because the Hindus support him wholeheartedly because he continues to advocate their cause, fight for, maintain their, priorities. So, in other words, he has come to this. By the end of this thing, Ambedkar is saying, contrary to what he said in the beginning, that the Hindus are as subject to their own ideology as anybody else, like the untouchables. That is, they are also the victims of the ideology which they believe in, and it is by realizing that these are false ideas, that these are actually just laws from an ancient period, that they will be able to liberate themselves. Right? So yeah, you want to, okay.
I don't know whether this is a stupid question, but
No, I'm sure.
yeah, I really, I haven't comprehended yet how, the whole caste system actually comes into being. You mentioned before that it's a set of laws, but how was it established and how was it, sort of distributed until it becomes a universal set of laws that are accepted by everyone in the Hindu religion?
Well, it has a very long history, and the Vedas, right? In the Vedas, which are about 3,000 years old, right? In the Vedas, you already have a reference to the 4 Varnas. Varnas are the big, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. This thing. So in the Vedas, you get the statement that God, out of Brahma, God, Prajapati, the castes were created. So the head, Brahmin is the head, and Kshatriya are the shoulders, and so on. It's connected to the body like that. Hierarchy. So at that point, the untouchability is not there. That reference is not there. But there is another term called Chandala, which is a denigrative term for the lowest of the worst, wretched kind of, which is outside of the caste system. But it's not clear whether that meant untouchability. Untouchability seems to have come into existence at a later stage, by and large, and essentially because based on the idea of the polluting professions, cleaning, handling dead bodies, handling the carcasses of animals, these kinds of things. So these were then assigned, as it were, to castes, groups of people who were then considered unclean because of the unclean work that they did, and so they were kept separate. So you see that in throughout history, there are many examples of this within the Varna system. The Shudra becomes king, the Brahmin also can become king, the Kshatriya can read a book and do all kinds of things which are meant for Brahmins, and the Kshatriya can become a businessman. All of these are possible. These kinds of shifts up and down the scale there are instances, but never is the untouchable ever becomes part of that flexibility. So in that sense, it has that kind of history, 3,000 years at least. Through, slowly over the centuries, it has become entrenched in the Indian social reality. As I said, it's not inflexible within the 4 Varna system. Within the 4 Varna system, there is some movement, across castes. So, for instance,
what is the logic of mobility or movement?
Well, it's historical, changes. For instance, one of the first instances is the Mauryas. Mauryas are BC in the 3rd century, 4th century BC. The Maurya Empire is considered an empire of Shudras by some historians. So, in that sense, because the thing is, the Brahmin priest is the one who recognizes your kingliness, right? So, which is there in all cultures. If you read Dumezil's work, Dumezil is the French anthropologist, his work, he'll show that in all ancient societies, the Brahmin and the Raja and the priest and the king, this combination is common to all, because the king's power has to be endorsed by the priest, but at the same time the priest is subordinate to the power of the king. It's so between them there is an ambiguity. You can't decide. There's always a conflict between whether the Kshatriya is superior or the Raja is superior. And the flamen dialis, this is the term which Dumézil uses to talk about rex, the rex and the flamen dialis. Flamen dialis is the priest, and so on. So this is a universal. Wherever there was sovereignty, monarchy, etc., you had that. So in that sense, what prevails in India at that point of time is something which prevailed everywhere. For instance, in Europe, what they call the estates, in the French Revolution, the estates, the aristocracy and the plebeians, the serfs and the priesthood. These are the estates, right? These are like the same caste order. In fact, estates are also known as castes. Often people refer to them as castes. But the point is that, first of all, the untouchability aspect is unique to the Asian context, and within Asia, India is the heartland of the untouchability phenomenon. In small minor ways, it's there in Japan and other places also. You have some instances. But as a general sort of phenomenon across a vast subcontinent, it's there in India. And this has been the most intransigent, the most resistant kind of social reality to come to transform. So all the modern ideas have not been able so far to make a significant dent on this front, the untouchability front. Other castes, you can say that although they continue to suffer structural inequality, of the same kind, it's not a palpable kind of discrimination that you can see. It's like even in say France, if you read Pierre Bourdieu's work, he shows that in spite of the Republic, things remain the same for the same. Those who are poor remain poor in the same position, and so on. The class structure is quite rigid in that sense. So in that sense, the Shudra continues to remain in a particular position, let us say. But even that is not entirely true, because often Shudra castes are very powerful agricultural castes. They have more money than the Brahmin. I don't know if there's this amazing Italian, The Leopard, the novel and the film. Have you ever seen that? This is written by an aristocrat, Giuseppe di Lampedusa, and it's about an aristocrat's relation with his priest. This aristocrat and this priest have these interesting conversations. Then the priest tells him, you must not do this, you must not do this, all against the consciences. And this man, sometimes he says, okay, and then says, hey, what nonsense, shut up, sit down. And so this relation between priest and aristocrat is a very, the priest is always in a lower, powerless position, socially powerless, but doctrinally, religiously powerful, right? That combination. So even the Brahmin often is in a subordinate position to the powerful Shudra landlords in many regions of India. So in that sense, within those four Varna systems, there's all kinds of ups and downs. It's not uniformly, that the hierarchy is the same. Ritual hierarchy is different from social hierarchy, and so on. Only the untouchable is an exception that remains separate from all of these kinds of otherwise flexible kind of operation of the caste system.
What is the proportion of the untouchables in Indian population?
About 15 definitely. 15 is known, but even more possibly. In some regions it will be 12, but 15 to 17% of the Indian population.
One would think
be able to mobilize these population for, to be able to join as workforce or, in the
That is an
industrial
interesting,
life.
yes, that's an interesting question. Now, in independent India, see, as soon as modernity comes in, colonial modernity, hierarchies begin to be affected. Old hierarchies begin to be affected. Now, what happens is, in a village, the landlord, let us say, the landlord is the most powerful person. The Brahmin in a village is not powerful at all, because the Brahmin it depends on the landlord and other rich people who give the dakshina, the money or the gifts or whatever, to survive. Ritually powerful, but socially dependent. Now, interestingly, what happens in the city is this landlord, he dresses and talks and behaves like an illiterate, because he doesn't study, he's not educated. He's got money, he wears ordinary clothes, but he's got money in his pocket, he's got wealth and he's got power there. But when he comes to the city people look at him, they can't tell him from the agricultural laborer. See, his whole position of supreme power in the village is suddenly reduced to nothing. Whereas the Brahmin, because the Brahmin is educated and because the English administration particularly identifies Brahmins as the ones who should be trained to take on the administration of India, so suddenly the Brahmins acquire a new power in the colonial setup, which they didn't have to the same degree in the older system. That is why everybody else says, we want those jobs also. It's not enough for you to be wealthy in your village, you want to have this other, share of this also. So even for the landed people of the rural side, they are interested in the jobs. Now, the untouchable situation is they have nothing, neither a position in the thing nor anything. It's completely the lowest in all situations, right? So then it becomes, this is the only avenue for them. Only if the British, can be petitioned, campaign, you can get some job reservations and so on and so on and so forth. This is the only possibility of mobility, because in the village they have nothing.
Then I have a question, like that both his parents and grandparents were soldiers in the British business.
East India Company.
So that's, and you say that's an alternative or another revenue for some kind of outside system upper mobility program. Whereas in Hong Kong you have the whole tribal, the Guptas. They've been hired by the British as mercenary, sent over all over the world and in Hong Kong. Okay, so, but they are not Chatelier.
They are not?
Chatelier, supposed to be the fighters' class. But they are not. They are not Chatelier to be
No, they are not.
the British
but
soldier. So Chatelier and the soldier is two different things.
No, but see, this is East India Company is not at that time. It has an army for its own private purposes. It's a private enterprise, right?
But
So
they recruit Dalit.
they recruit whoever is coming to. They are not worried about that. Once the British government is established through the British Parliament, takes charge of the affairs of India, then you have all kinds of regiments. So then they start looking. The Punjabis are martial race, the Nepalis are a martial race, the Gurkhas, and so on. They start looking at who is, and the Bengalis are effeminate, and all kinds of stereotypes start coming into play. But even so, the Dalits are there, but they'll obviously within the army, some immunity from the social things will develop.
Is it possible you have a Dalit general in the
No,
Indian?
Hardly. I can't think of. Yeah. No, but I mean, theoretically it's possible, but in practice, in the structure is such that it's difficult.
I have just a question. You are speaking about 1930s, right? At this time, the debate over the caste was even already on the man on the higher level. But how these debates appear in Indian society? How it happens that people start to think about these things?
About caste.
Yeah.
Oh, it starts happening in the 19th century already. Different pockets. I mentioned Jyotiba Phule. Jyotiba Phule was from a very low caste, not an untouchable caste, but a very low caste. And he was one of the most active reformers in the 19th century. Started schools, educated people, and started various kinds of institutions for, and started a critique of Hindu society and, campaigned for the need to change Hindu society and all that. And even the reformed Brahmins and other upper castes are in the 19th century in Bengal, for instance, and in Maharashtra and in the urban centers of colonial India, you can see that the new middle class, which we read about earlier, they are looking at themselves with new eyes, when after the arrival of the British, and they are seeing the caste system as one of the stigmas, one of the things that they should be ashamed of. But they are thinking mainly about the reform of their own societies. That is, within the upper castes, there is all kinds of practices which are considered to be, in need of reform, such as child marriage, widow, perpetual widowhood, where widows cannot remarry, and all kinds of ritual, sati, and all kinds of practices like that. So that becomes the focus of attention. So in other words, they are looking at how to reform our own society, and others are looking at how the whole thing has to be. Ranade, for instance, and later Rabindranath Tagore, and many others. And so different people, and in the south there are figures like Ayodhi Das and Periyar and so on. So these are all people who are realizing that India's bane is caste, that India's worst feature is caste, and you have to do something about it. And each reformist will think of the caste question in different ways, limited ways or more comprehensive ways. It's already, there is a history of it.
Okay, are you telling us that actually after acquiring the knowledges from the West and the ideas, whatever, liberal ideas from the West,
Yeah.
the Indian society started to think about itself as a, let me say, having a problem with the Irish caste?
Yeah, it does not mean that there was nothing before. Even before there were. But those were anti-caste movements long before the arrival of the British. They were there. But they took place under different historical circumstances. So, for instance, the Bhakti movement, some people say that when Islam came to India, it had an impact. So the Bhakti movement started, where they said ritual caste is bad, and you have to get rid of caste and purify yourself, and individual bhakti, devotion to God, makes everybody equal. Right?
Buddhism is against it.
And if you go even further back in history, there is Buddhism. Right? And theoretically, even Buddhism and Jainism are not bound to caste, theoretically speaking. They have so different points. There have been many sort of uprisings, violent actions also there have been, and spiritual movements. Kabir, for instance, Kabir is an amazing figure. The paper, which Millin's paper brings out the sort of originality of Kabir. A weaver, who is one of the greatest poets India has produced. Kabir's verses are sung even today by ordinary people. Not it's not a literature in the high literature. It's ordinary, as the most beautiful sort of using the weaving metaphor. The various kinds of things, and talking about coexistence of religions and existence beyond religion and so on. And it was a movement. And then there are these, for instance, Shivaji. Shivaji is a king. He's a Shudra king. He's not a high caste king. Now, Shivaji becomes possible because of Bhakti movement. Bhakti movement, in some ways, loosens the caste hierarchies in some ways and enables Shudras to rise to power. So, yeah, there have been many such. But what happens under British rule is that a new kind of... So, see, these things happen, then they go away. Order is restored again. Once again, there will be some eruption. And so on. Throughout history, you have many such. But the latest British phase is when the Western ideas about progress and enlightenment and equality and emancipation, etc., create conditions for a new anti-caste sort of movement. Yeah.
I don't know what to put the question. It's in a way it's easy to understand this issue theoretically, and also I think all of us reading it with certain uncertainty or difficulty. For instance, Dalits. Is Dalits one of the untouchable?
No.
Or it's in different region.
No, it's a interesting and important question. I'll just explain it.
Question like this.
Yeah, it needs some clarification. Now, you have the Varna and Jati. Actually, when we say caste, this is what we mean. Means innumerable small groups of people who marry within their community, who do not marry outside, and who have all kinds of rules and regulations about who you can eat with, whose water you can drink, and so on. Right? This is the caste thing. Now, Varna is theoretical, sort of, is kind of Hindu sociology, ancient Hindu sociology. What it says is, there are these four things, the priesthood, the king, the trader, the one who does the menial labor, the Shudra, right? So, these castes, these are innumerable, and they belong to one or the other of these. They fall under these categories. Now, as you can imagine, this can never be a scientific thing. It cannot be, self-evident, because you might say that that person belongs to this Shudra, but they might think that they belong to Kshatriya.
They themselves can decide.
No, that's the thing, because this is a very loose kind of designation. It doesn't have, the only people who are very strongly entrenched in their Varnas are the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. Brahmins, basically the Brahmins and the Vaishyas, because they are the, they're the vegetarian caste, and their castes are not just castes, they are specific jobs, literary and priestly duties, and learning and so on, and trade. And trade also, it comes with a certain kind of trading communities tend to be very cohesive, for in the old days, for reasons which had to do with surviving in, those kinds of social conditions. These, on the other hand, are very loosely defined, because this Kshatriya defines both the king and the soldier, whoever fights. So, already you have, a group which is, so anybody who fights, now the fights, how can you get only you obviously poor people will join the army, then, and so on. So they are flexible. They're not really all that systematic. And you will find that in each region, each caste will claim for itself some status. It will say we are actually this particular type of kshatriya, or something. So they'll have some story about their past and so on. So that's your basic situation as far as sociology of it is concerned. Then in British period, several different names were and then you have the untouchable, right? Now all of them, whatever they might say about each other, they are all agreed about these people being separate. Their separation is absolute. Now the colonial period, they started calling them depressed classes, etc., and then they were included in a schedule of the constitution. In 1930, when they adopted a constitution for India, they put them in a schedule, and because they were listed, a list, in a schedule of the constitution, they came to be known as scheduled castes. It's a very governmental term. It's not a Then you have Gandhi gives them the name Harijan. Say Gandhi wants to give them something to be proud of. He says Harijan means children of God, people of God. So Gandhi is sort of giving them a name which compensates for their social status in some ways, right? But Ambedkar says we are the Dalit. Dalit means pushed under, oppressed, basically it means. Dalit, the word Dalit means oppressed. Basically, Dalit is a political identity assumed by the untouchables in the context of their emancipatory struggles. So it's not, a name that has any other. It's a political, and so Dalit is not an official term. It's in the records of the state. You will not find this term being used. They will say scheduled caste, or they will say refer to the caste name. Mala, Madiga, Chamar, and so on. But all of them together were called the Dalit castes by the organizers of the Dalits, of the untouchables, the leaders. They assumed and they spread this terminology among the people, saying we are the Dalits. So it's a political identity. So in fact, what is happening more recently is that some people, some castes within the Dalit fold are realizing that they are getting marginalized within the SC, ST, SC category. Because even among them there are great differences. So they, when there are reservations, for instance, the Mahars of Maharashtra, they generally had, on the whole, a different kind of experience than the same kind of category of people elsewhere. Because many of them are agriculturalists, they do have some land, they were in the military, so they got some benefits of that military sort of experience and all that. Whereas there is another community which has always been looking after removing the carcasses and so on, and so they've never had any opportunity at all, but they are also part of this Dalit category. So in the more recent context, when one or two of them come into educational fields, they realize that they can't compete with their own fellow Dalit members. because they are marginalized, because these are some of them are, and so they have now they retain the Dalit identity as a political identity, but for other purposes they are now asking for separation of these castes. So they want the reservations to be broken up according to different statuses within the. So it's very, very complicated.
Are there people crossing the border on the other side, like people who belong to caste but feel that they are oppressed by a specific social system, and so they will join the Dalit?
They will join the Dalits. There are movements which want to unite them. This term is now being used a lot. Dalit Bahujan. Bahujan means the large majority, the vast masses, you know. So there is a party called Bahujan Samaj Party. Means majority society party. The party of the masses. Basically what it means. This actually is a Dalit party. You know, its leadership is Dalit and OBC, you know, and Bahujan. But currently, the current leader is a Dalit woman, Mayawati. So this is one place where you can see an attempt to bring them together, saying that the Dalits and the lower castes, even the Shudras, and the poorest of the poor have a common goal, and they should unite and so on. And it also sometimes includes minority, you know, and so nowadays an alliance between Dalits, Bahujans and minority is also being attempted. Muslims and other tribals, Adivasi. Adivasi is a tribal identity. Many tribes across the Indian subcontinent. So Christians, many Christians in the northeast, for instance, come under the minority, Adivasi category. They are tribal populations. So they do come under this to some extent. But the mainland, the central Indian social context, the Christians have not been, because the Christians are much smaller as a population segment. And secondly, among the minorities, the Muslims are the worst off socially. And in fact, some would argue, as Rajendra Sachar, who wrote a whole report on the condition of the Muslims in a few years ago, and say possibly the absolute social condition of the Muslims is worse than even that of the Dalits. Worse than Dalits in some areas.
But there's also read somewhere Muslim was even, because of the influence by the caste order, then created caste
within Muslim, yeah. In fact, Ambedkar is talking about that, right? That's the whole thing, that there is a caste within the Muslim and even Christian also. Within Christians also. In the sense that the doctrine promises equality, but in practice, these are maintained. I mean, it has happened in South Africa. Christianity made a compromise with race, right? I mean, they ensured that whites and blacks have their own different Christian churches and so on. It's the same thing here. Among Muslims, one of the divisions is between the converted locals and those who can trace their ancestry to some Arab or Persian or other, immigrant population.
So Ambedkar was he the first, how should I say, not only a spokesperson, but a political leader for the Dalit movement?
The first most effective. They were Dalit leaders in the Congress. There is MC Raja, there is one Tamil Dalit leader. And some people, in retrospect, some people say that Raja was quite an important Dalit leader. But that Ambedkar was so powerful that Raja was sidelined and so on. So like that there are, and then there is an Ayodhi Das, not very well known to the northern and Indians, but in the south, at least in the intelligentsia he is known. Ayodhi Das, he ran a paper, Orupaisa Tamilan, it's a Tamil thing, where it was in the turn of the century, 1900, around that time. He wrote a lot and he used a kind of etymological analysis to argue for that the Dalits are actually the Buddhists who were suppressed by the resurgent Hinduism. So he tried to make a kind of connection back to Buddhism, because at that time. So Ambedkar's Buddhism is actually not a new thing. The Dalit connection with Buddhism goes back to people like Ayodhi Das, who already had made that connection that the Dalits are the real Buddhists.
Ambedkar's changing position
Yeah.
to address. Eventually he's trying to say this is impossible.
Right.
Unless we destroy the whole damn thing.
Yeah.
Then he makes the final move, say, for Buddhism.
Yeah.
Because Buddhism was much more inclusive, right? That was the argument.
For a number of reasons, which is among the Indian religions, Buddhism is known to have made the attempt to transcend the caste barriers, to argue against this hierarchy. That is one reason. So, among the Indian native born religions, it is an enlightened religion compared to Hinduism. And it is also a known fact of Indian history that up to the 8th century, Buddhism was dominant in India, Buddhism, Jainism. But under the able leadership of this South Indian man called Shankaracharya, Hinduism defeated Buddhism, basically chased it out to China and Vietnam and so on, and made India Hindu again. So there is that history. And thirdly, Ambedkar was looking for a religion which is indigenous, so that conversion is can be a political statement without being an antagonizing move.
But you mentioned that within other religions there existed also caste.
Yeah.
So does this mean being converted into other religion doesn't make one?
No, this is the thing. Ambedkar is actually answering that question here, which is what he is saying is, in other religions the ideals are different from the practices. Islamic ideals are universal. In practice, they observe caste. Hinduism, the ideals are caste based and the practice also is caste based. So that is.
But this seems to me more of a social issue rather than religious issue, because no matter, as long as you are born
Right.
a Hindu,
Mm.
then it doesn't matter which religion you're converted to.
Exactly.
It's still
Yeah, no, that's an argument you can make against Ambedkar's treatment of the question. But what he is trying to do is, he is trying to polemicize against Hinduism by saying that you are different from the other religions because even your ideals are tainted. So, within the context of Indian struggle between the Dalits and their leadership for their demands, and the Indian National Congress with its Hindu sort of plank, with its soft thing for Hinduism, his argument is against that. But yes, this question that you are raising is a very important one, which is it not after all? So Ambedkar's point is what we should discuss, which is what you are raising actually, which is it the case that if you destroy the Shastras, the caste system will disappear.
Right.
And how do you destroy the Shastras? Because he seems to think that it's a question of realization. No? It's very clear. Hindus must be made to realize that what they think are sacred texts are only laws. And if they do that, then the religious basis of caste will go, and caste will then go with it.
It's one, I think now the argument still plays on the ideas and textuality.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, whether the thing is a problem at the bottom. But if we look at the assumption, I don't know how to frame it. Like what he said here, my idea would be society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Right? That's familiar. And let's take it, for now. But if we ask the question, it's not only the Hindu religion. Like in practice, even Muslim and so on,
Yeah.
caste are built in there.
Right.
But an annihilation of caste means the annihilation of religion will not be limited to Hindu, right? Because in practice all set up.
Yeah.
Even you rewrite the text, whatever the Bible,
Yeah.
that will not change the thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't follow that.
Yes.
And one of the questions I think can be raised is, if this is the idea, right, what will be the condition to be created for these things to happen?
Yes.
Rather than say, let's forget about everyone, forget about your religion, let's destroy Hindu,
Yeah.
right? But these things still happen.
Yeah. No.
Right.
So basically,
After almost 1 century or something.
yeah. Basically, what he is saying is make Hindu religion conform in its overall structure to the other religions. That is, the other religions, there is a dichotomy between doctrine and practice. Hindu religion, there is no dichotomy between doctrine and practice. So, if Hindu religion is reorganized according to one, with one sacred text and a priesthood which is reorganized, without Brahminism as a, birth as a condition, remove birth as a condition, and so it becomes consonant with other. So, other societies have hierarchies and practical violations of doctrine. So, he is not at this point objecting to that. He is saying that's, yeah, we know that, we can deal with it separately. So, what he is saying is, even to start thinking about changing that reality, Hindus are not ready. So, in other words, Christians are ready to move towards a proletarian revolution because they have fellow feeling. The proletarians have solidarity among themselves. So, therefore, they can try. But in India, you cannot even begin to try that because you haven't yet reached that stage where the proletarians can feel that we are all one. So, that's what is the his position on this.
He is a kind of revolutionary, but he's kind of soft at the end, it's just conscious, but he wants to create some kind of condition for social revolution.
But not in the Marxist sense.
No,
Not in the Marxist sense,
but,
yeah.
That's what he said, because already in the previous text, they never mentioned revolution. It's like a term which is not
Right, yeah.
useful in India.
Right.
And
But
has
here
to
he
tell
is mentioning it.
Why
Yeah.
are we not have this habit of asking, opposing the notion of revolution?
What is can we draw the parallel here between if the Marxists arguing for annihilation of capitalism,
Right.
is that the same logic, annihilation of caste?
No, indeed. It's a very, apt
Within
question.
India, let's put it, first.
Yeah. No, it's an apt question, and it also is one of the the weak point of this essay. One of the weak points. point about caste that you raised is one, and the other one is that Ambedkar is explicitly refuting the base superstructure model.
Right.
Correct? Yeah, in this thing he is saying changing the economy as a means of changing society is false. But in his own thinking, he is employing the base superstructure model in another dimension, in another place, between society and religion. He is proposing that religion is the base and caste is the superstructure. So to change caste, you have to attack the base, which is religion, isn't it? I mean, that's very much how he poses the question. But it's not the same base as Marxist base. It's a different kind of understanding of the base. Meaning so in effect, the base superstructure model is, in its abstract form, is very much part of his apparatus, thinking apparatus. Only it is displaced into this domain. But the problem there is that having displaced it, what he has also abandoned is the idea that changing the economic base involves revolution, which is a kind of practical, social, transformative thing. Whereas when he comes to the religion as the base of caste system, he is employing the realization. So it operates within the consciousness. So both religion and caste. So in a peculiar way, it's inverted. Caste is a social practice. Religion is a doctrine. It's a consciousness issue. But the consciousness issue is rendered base here to a social practice.
But if you mix Ambedkar with Marxist position, would it be, if I can imagine, two-state revolution?
Right. No, that's what he is effectively suggesting, that it has to be two-stage in India, because that preparation for the revolutionary kind of activity is not there. Socially, we are not in a position to undertake that kind of activity. Yeah, so it's a two-stage, as you said, correct.
I think he's also very practical in what is to be done. He suggests the priesthood should not be politically paralyzed and support or whatever. So you have to deprive the priesthood as the God keeper of the sutra being legitimized by stakeholders.
State. Yeah, the priests have to be appointed by the state.
Yeah. So
Like
in
the
this
civil
sense, it is
examination
very practical.
system.
Like public exam, you have to have an exam for, yes.
Okay, I think in this sense, he's a very practical.
Right.
Just
No, he is.
subvert the whole material basis of the priesthood.
Huh.
To subvert.
But he is also.
Gatekeeper of the sutra.
But he is also proposing a state religion, which is, the Hegelian some kind of Hegelian reference, which he gives to make a state religion, which one has to discuss what that means, right?
I cannot feel sort of keep come to my mind. If we forget about untouchable for the moment, because you cannot say annihilation of caste only means annihilation of the untouchable, right? As a system.
Right. No. Yeah.
So in other words, even the disappearance of the untouchable does not mean the disappearance of caste, right?
Oh.
Will still be operating, right? These are even the other four categories and so on, right? But what I want to say is, if we to name it as a religion was a modern practice. Let's put it for the moment. So in other words, it's a little bit silly in trying to say it was a social system,
Right.
a rough social system
Yeah. Yeah.
operating. And for all of us sitting here, we don't have to study. You know, for the Chinese Han society, there is very similar to this, right?
Yeah.
The scholar,
Yeah.
right? The peasantry,
Yeah.
the labor, and the businessmen actually on the bottom, hierarchically speaking.
Mm.
Obviously, the businessmen tend to be rich, scholar poor. So in other words, the earlier mode of life
Yeah.
rests on, if I may,
The
social
estates.
mode of production, whatever you want.
Yeah,
to
yeah,
say,
yeah.
Right. Economy wasn't, money wasn't the thing valued most, right? In very similar way. And then once you hit into these more contemporary moment, this gets pulled out, right? So certain elements get. This is a little bit like Ashish Nandi argument. I mean, all these elements are already operating within the system.
Mm.
Then, because this moment comes around with capitalism or what have you,
Yeah.
then money becomes something to be valued.
Mm.
So some people from the bottom to the top, and so on. But
Education becomes the new source of wealth and status. Yeah.
and so on. Then sort of universalized, right? And for whatever the nation state building. So how should I say? So it is in a way, it's a historically generated, socially practiced, but then goes through transformation, right? And even with the let's take in a way the feminist argument. You know, the gender equality is slowly boosted by capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
For all that. The same thing with untouchable. Right? But somehow still running.
No, that's the thing.
Let me finish the argument. Because or the question is, the stability one imagines will be maintained in the rural
areas.
in the city, and this is less obvious, less organized in that sense. But then when you get to certain issue, almost undeniable. I mean, right? I mean, when you ask any Indian scholar, they say 75% Brahmin scholar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So this is the
Yeah.
reality.
That's the reality.
But
Yeah.
how do you explain that? One, you can say Brahmin was from the historical, time zone was already trained to be scholar,
Yeah. Well, that's certainly.
right? And
Yeah.
so how? I mean, so.
No, because the capitalist society, which is the disruptive force in modern times, has been completely kept under control in India. And because it's a vast population and the economy's, the national economy's requirements were limited until very recently in terms of thing, you could restrict it because it is the opinion of many economists and political scientists that the Indian bureaucracy deliberately funded the primary education, because primary education is where the poorest people need the first real boost in order to create general equality of skills and abilities and so on. Whereas the middle class, the ones we have been reading about, the middle class requires subsidized education at the higher level. At the lower level, it's capable of looking after its own. It's when you get to engineering, medicine and so on. And that is what is reflected in India's education policy, is very much higher education oriented educational policy. Complete neglect, complete handing over of education at the primary level to private sector. Private sector education, which is half of it is complete sham. It is just cheating people, taking their money in the promising English medium education and so on. It is, it destroys whatever native skills they have and provides no new skills. This is happening to the largest sections of the people. Somehow, and because the pyramid, the top of the pyramid is so small, there is always good people to employ for those positions, because relative to the population it's a small number. So it looks as if the system is very successful, but actually the number of casualties, which who suffered in the process of achieving that is, it's tremendous. It's just overwhelming. That is the reality.
But
And
that's the reality of all the third world countries. It's very common, right? Not exclusive to India.
no, maybe, but that's we don't have then you should talk about all the third world countries. But that is the situation. You have to.
Yeah, it's not exclusive to India. So India is not an exception.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you have to see, whether social inequalities from a previous regime are the primary reason for people being deprived of opportunities. That specific question, if you pose, I feel India will be among a few countries which have that particular kind of peculiar social construction. Yeah, rate of literacy has been stagnant. It's rising now because now the new conditions have come, and that is why today the situation with the liberalization and globalization is actually much more mobile, much more volatile than it has ever been, because now private interests, that is capital's interests, are actually being reflected in the social in a way that it was not in the earlier, where the bureaucracy was a filtering mechanism which kept regulating the flow, the functioning of capital. Today it's different. There is direct capitalist intervention in the society, and so and even now it is like somewhere near 60% with all of this literacy. And when you talk about literacy, you don't mean education. You mean literally, basically, signing your name. That kind of very, very attenuated, minimal skills, which actually don't add up to much in terms of employability or anything like that. So, yeah.
What I can't understand is that why is India so resilient towards the possibilities of change, or let's say annihilation of caste system?
Yeah.
Because as Washington says, it's similar, or like
Yeah.
in other countries, in traditional society, there was certain kind of caste.
Yeah.
Although in China we had Kejutsu, which probably promoted examination.
See, the two
Possible.
two
And
forces.
alternatives. And also in Japan, when the Christians, the Jesuits, came to spread their religion, the poorest part of the society tend to be converted. They choose to.
Yeah, that's happened in India also.
It seems to me that there is a sort of psychological thing existed, and also within the untouchables, they were convinced that they deserve to live this way of life, because there's nothing you can escape.
Well, that is ideological, isn't it? I mean, you said about fate and destiny, this is where and so on. These are part of, you see, that old social order comes with these kinds of ideological supplements, right? Now, historically, there have been only two forces which induce change. In the sense, people don't want to change. No people has ever just wanted to change for the sake of change. The two kinds of things is basically capitalism and some kind of post-capitalist, socialist or other kinds of precipitate action. These are the two things which completely destabilize a society and create conditions for new developments, which will put those old social realities behind. Forget about them, right? Or render them ineffectual. This is the only thing that we can say historically. If you look at the world, this is the only way that these are the two things. Now in India and wherever an aristocracy wants to preserve its privileges, it will fight capitalism as much as it will fight socialism or whatever, right? So in India, colonial rule was actually a barrier to capitalist growth. The British did not want India to become a full-fledged capitalist country, because they require it to be in a particular state in order for it to be profitable kind of colony for itself. In that process, they generated an intellectual class, a landed aristocracy, a nobility, and a princely, princes and all of these people who had a stake in the same order that the British were interested in, because their interests were also coinciding with their interests. Now, when independence was conceived, when the idea of a free India was conceived, the question obviously would be whether this freedom is from just British people or from older social structures, right? So in the freedom movement, you have both. You have the people who think of freedom as in the new way, right? Republican, democratic, etc. The others think of freedom as simply elimination of foreign rule. They don't want social change. They only want political seat, the seat of power to be handed over to them. Because they want the existing colonial structure to remain with themselves occupying the seat of power. Now that is their interest. So in India, what happened basically is that in the time of our revolution, which is 1947 to 1950, which is the time of adopting the constitution, basically the forces which were against change triumphed over the forces that might have wanted change.
Well, it seems to be very different sentiment you're just stating, because there's another layer, if I can insert, into the two forces you mentioned, capitalism and whatever, socialism. There is a certain role of nationalism.
But that is very much a socialistic. It never comes separately from socialism.
It can go into different direction, right? But
if you look at African nationalisms and even post-colonial nationalisms, by and large, they tend to have first of all, they have Soviet backing. This is one thing. But in that way, it's not that it's some socialism in some pure sense, but that socialist world of the Cold War period, that whole formation, that was very much a condition of possibility for these nationalisms. That's my.
But I guess because I'm taking your point in, because your explanation for things staying the same is from, for instance, education as a site for change.
Education is, yes, education, right? But also social reform, land reforms, all of these.
Yeah.
All of these were, suppressed or.
But our experience, right, with the, if I can say, universal education, did not come from the capitalist strike, more coming from the nationalist strike, right? To, I don't want to say indoctrinate, but to universalize, providing literacy and so on. Also indoctrination.
See, Japan and China, your nationalisms are older, isn't it? That is early 20th or late 19th century, right? It's a different period. these nationalisms are very much, capitalism, modernity, capitalist modernity is the context for the rise of these nationalisms, isn't it, in Japan and China?
Well, I wonder whether I can pursue this
Or is it or not? I mean, I'm not sure, but
from other perspective, okay? And for instance, in the more feudal China, in China, we have the 4 classes. But you look at the modern Taiwan, it's still there,
okay,
right?
right.
We've been through capitalism, we've been through public revolution, or what? But the society itself is not exactly reformed as much as you want to reform the caste.
Right.
Then in the capitalist system, you have the big class divide, even worse. Okay, with the rich is 2,000 times the rich. Then in the socialist bloc, you have the nomenclatura. Okay.
Nomenclatura,
And
yeah.
all those things. So keeping all this in context, then one thing can be, just for argument's sake, the question is, where do we go from here? Then Nafe is here. One writer is very interesting and very controversial, who is Louis Dumont. Okay, his argument about the homo hierarchicus, use the caste system. Okay, he's being criticized, blasted, or whatever. But in a sense, ironically, he's not totally crazy. It doesn't make sense. It does make sense. With all this empirical, historical backlash and facts. Okay, so how do we read it? Because he can say very sarcastically, all the modern enlightenment, after enlightenment ideology of equality, equalism in the country and in the political system we claim, actually practice totally opposite. Only in the primordial tribal they talk about authoritarianism, but they actually practice egalitarianism. Okay, that's he makes such a statement.
Yeah.
Okay, and with the capitalists against the capitalism, as well as the so-called socialist reform, he would say that, okay, very well, we're giving all these things, but if it is a vicious circle, reincarnation, okay, is happening, okay. Whether there's something we can think about social system, people have their more or less secure place to be in, it is not the worst.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's something what to think about, because the whole thing of this 400 years world history is triumph of the economy.
Yeah.
Okay, the coming into being of the economic man.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, if there's the coming into being of the economy man, and it is the triumph of our economy, we are still in this vicious circle, this path of incarnation. So I think whether that's push a little bit too much from your argument, but from our experience, okay, we have a democratization, have all these things, but we did not reform the society as much, or at even beginning the society as we would like, vis-a-vis what we don't like that much is the caste system.
So you're saying that the caste system actually makes for a society?
This is our page 67, where Bhagat actually takes on Gandhi.
Yeah.
Let's simplify the matter. You bring out before. It's pretty much caste versus class issue
Yeah.
involved here. And he's trying to say, Gandhi is trying to suggest that caste system was better than class. On the ground, the caste was the best possible adjustment of social stability,
Mm.
and so on and so forth. But then, how would I don't know how would Bhagat frame his
Yeah, how to understand the Gandhian position. I have difficulty to understand Gandhian position, and I would hate to just dismiss it. Okay, it may make some, you have to reread it.
Well, whatever you may say, I mean, we don't have to decide about it now. But one thing is, Ambedkar is not the only one who is disagreeing with Gandhi on it. Everybody disagrees with Gandhi on it. Nehru disagrees with it. Nobody believes. At the most, what people like Nehru, Tagore will say is, there was a time in Indian history where caste system was good for those times. That much they will say. Today it has become this thing. Now Gandhi is doing something different. He is saying, today I want Varna to remain, because without it Hinduism loses its identity. Now this, nobody other than Gandhi himself and in the Congress actually endorses this idea. I mean, publicly they may think that it's a
But if Gandhi has in mind, let's argue about it.
Mm.
If he had in mind this caste system without untouchability,
Yeah.
is this acceptable?
No, that's what it comes up here. Without untouchable caste system, without untouchability is nevertheless birth based. See, that's the whole point. As long as it's based on birth, it requires policing. So Ambedkar asked the question, who will police and keep them separate?
But according to your description, actually in reality, he's moving.
No, but that's exactly. No, but that's in practice. The Gandhi is assuming. That's why Ambedkar says, let us look at your own life history. Are you following the profession of your caste, your parents? You are not. You are a politician. And then he gives many different examples of people. Gandhi's son who is doing something different. Any number of people who are not doing the things that they are supposed to do. So the question is, why is Gandhi saying that you should have Varna in the thing, in that birth related sense? So Ambedkar's answer is, he is not saying it because he believes in it. He knows very well that that is no longer prevalent. He is saying it because that is what gets him the support of all the powerful Hindus. And that's what keeps him in that place, in that Mahatma's position. So,
It seems to me that we are here mixing two things together. One is the nationalist movement in India, and the second is this social evolution, as Julian mentioned, or those social changes in the society. I believe that actually the common fate of India and China, or no China, but Taiwan, as mentioned, is that actually the societies, or not societies, but the political system was reformed by those quite narrow strata of some middle class or elite. Actually, you never experience really the social revolutions. That's the problem. We are here speaking about two things. And even India, just on the way of the national movement, no on the level of the real social changes.
Yeah,
They are still under the divide.
Exactly. That's Ambedkar's point.
Yeah,
Actually.
he is actually just a part of the national movement. No, he is passively the social reformer who was exploiting the contemporary national debate. So They
Yeah.
are actually speaking about two things, and it's why we pretty much.
No, the social question is the important question for Ambedkar. And throughout, from the 19th century onwards, there has been split between those who want the social revolution
Yeah, exactly.
and those who say that is not important, that can be postponed, that is not required.
Let's kick the British out.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
the problem will stop.
Exactly, yeah. So
You know,
that's
I
it.
think what Philip, or if I can position, I'm sorry, Philip's point is he's talking about the Eastern European social revolution, with also reference to the Chinese revolution. These are the real social revolution, right?
No,
Whereas
not necessarily,
India,
but
India and Taiwan never went through such social. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's what basically what I
Social
said.
cultural
Actually.
revolution.
Yeah, because actually the social revolution in those countries came much later after the nationalist movement or the achievement of the national
Yeah.
independence.
no, the social revolution question is also to be one of the other angles from which to see it is European social revolutions happen across several centuries in a slow process of capitalist, and capitalism and ideas about community development, new ideas coming into existence. So you have, early developments of capitalism, English Revolution, and French, ideas about contract theory and all of these things. Economic development, social developments, religious developments, Luther, and all, different types of things are happening, and then you have a transformed society, which sort of the revolutions actually establish the new societies as reality, right? French Revolution, American, English, whatever. But the thing is, here you have a colonial situation. Now, in colonial situation, social revolution of that primordial kind, which happens by itself spontaneously through historical processes over centuries, is no longer possible. No, under colonial conditions, you no longer have that open field where those societies can simply evolve into, and to transform their societies in when faced with capitalistic or new economic conditions. See, the idea is that one argument would be economic forces change, new economic forces enter the picture. Society, in response to it, undergoes destabilization, reconstitution, and social revolution as a result. As a result of these kinds of changes in the economic forces, that new economic forces come in.
But I can compare very easily the Indians case with Vietnamese case actually. The Vietnamese, actually almost the same thing appeared during the Vietnamese national movement at the same place. But for various reasons, the social idea or the communists won the independence struggle or the race for in the independence struggle in Vietnam. So seems to me that's something else. It's just simply because the middle class or the higher strata of society were not as big as in India, or the French were not that willing to give them the independence as in case of India. So it's actually opened the road for communists to exploit the desire of the lower classes, not only to enjoy or to join the national movement, but also to promote their social position or their living standards and so on.
But India is a much greater, a country with a much greater population than
And more complicated picture.
And more-
or even
See,
China.
Yeah,
So
of
it's
course.
difficult.
It also raises the question of Indian communism, which is an interesting thing, because one of the big complaints about Indian communism is that all the leadership is entirely Brahmins. So it's again caste enters the communist field also. So it's like this intermeshing of caste with all kinds of things, is makes for a
Caste practice is not everywhere same. In Bengal, like caste treatment is completely different from the rest of the part.
Hmm.
Like even we in Bengal in early 20th century there were reformers, also caste representatives, like even Jogannath Manto, and also Patiram Roy and other people who are Western educated, and they rise up at like not as national level but to local level, and they represented all these things. And very vitally, they were actually hoping for a separate entity as with Pakistan. So during the partition movement, they supported the Muslim League. So what happened, but Muslim League actually they wanted to have a separate nation and desperately, so they seek for their. It's completely different, like 1937 election and whatever the outcome. But whatever happened afterwards, after the partition, these people, caste people, who identify themselves as non-Hindus, they were treated as Hindus inside the Islamic Pakistan. So there was like a persecution and all these things started happening after 1947, when these people fall into that Pakistan part. And they felt betrayed, and even Jogannath Manto, he was against all the Hindu and all these things. So he resigned. He was the first law minister of Pakistan. So after 3 years, he resigned from his post and he took the push to India. So that's completely different. Ambedkar also first supported Pakistan.
I'm not saying that Vietnam is actually not different from India, but if I compare Vietnam with mainland China, I can get quite clear picture. So I think that my argument was correct. If I am perfectly aware that India is very difficult place from a religion point of view and whatever. But so let's look on the mainland China. We will get very similar picture like in Vietnam. Because actually what get the communist rise into the power was possibly World War II. But in a sense, it's also a kind of national movement, right, against the Japanese.
No,
and
the
then,
Chinese nationalist movement
pardon, but I
took
would
place
say
a lot earlier, at the beginning of the 20th
but
century.
actually, on the beginning of the World War II, communists were cooperating with KMT against the Japanese forces.
That was just like strategic
No, but I think, I don't know how we think this. I think Madhava point out one thing. Let's separate out Taiwan for the moment. Madhava was pointing to the fact that India was under colonial rule, right? Under the British, which mainland China never had that.
That's true, but
Right?
on the other hand,
So what I mean is what sort of revolution, even I don't know how to pose the question with reference to India. Right? I mean, was the 1911 revolution, was that a revolution at all? Right? Or something? Or not? So some people try to argue the revolutionary process goes on for 27 years. It's not until 1949. Right? This is one process. So it is. What I'm saying is we can compare with any experience, but all seem to be quite different.
in a sense, of course, everywhere are some different historical or I don't know regional setups. I am not denying that. But actually, if you will say that, of course, China or mainland was not under the colonial rule, but it was also supposed to some unequal treaties and so on. Actually,
Of course.
So generally speaking,
And there was no such stable system as the British system. We formulate the entire society. I mean systematically. So in that sense different. Right? But in what way, I'm not saying which one is better or worse, but how do we pick up the differences and try to explain how different places work differently. So it's not like whether class is better than class. How can the issue be raised in a meaningful way? I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
So one of the ways also to pose the question is when there are historical forces which are known to be disruptive of older social law. Right? Now, so the question under that arising from that is what enables a society to resist such forces which would otherwise, under normal conditions, lead to changes. So, what are these peculiar conditions which enable the old order to sustain itself? That's why I cited that Lampedusa, that novel called The Leopard, where the famous thing is the aristocracy joins the Garibaldi's forces. Why? And so this old aristocrat asked this young aristocrat, why are you going and joining them? They are fighting us. He says, you don't understand. We have to change everything so that everything can remain the same. Right? That is the thing. There is.
So you see caste a little bit as acting in this.
That in India, the participation of the Indian elite in the national movement has that dimension to it. It is a way to, regulate and minimize change, right?
So in that sense, he's right. Like he point exactly at caste means untouchable.
Right. Yeah.
Caste
Yeah.
is based on untouchability.
Exactly. Yeah.
So he's attacking exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, after even if there is no untouchable, we cannot speak about caste.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
It's,
then we can use class.
you can actually turn it into a class thing. I mean, it has no untouchability is what. Yes, you're right. Is what sustains the casteness of caste, which is otherwise flexible enough to be, continuous with class differences.
But what do you see? Because it keeps shifting. Because you can see the new emergent things.
Yeah.
Do you see that tendency?
That tendency is there, as I said, in the upper, not among the untouchables. Among the untouchables also, the Dalit caste also, there is some degree of it. But what I feel is, it is too early to say what kind of impact this current moment of capitalist, full-scale capitalism has been in India now for 15 years, 20 years. Fully opening up the economy. And what impact it will have, it's still early to say, but I feel that since colonial days, this is the first actual moment of a openness to change. And it is basically an openness to capitalism.
With the issue, with regard to the issue of, untouchability.
Of?
With regard to the issue of the untouchability.
With regard to that, it is the first time, because it is the kind of new working class that's emerging, right? In India, especially in the service sector, because there are not a lot of manufacturing jobs in India at the moment. Manufacturing is an old, sector of the economy. Today, under globalization, what's happening is all the new things are in the service sector. Restaurants, offices, there's lift boys, these kinds of petrol pumps and all kinds of new shops and so on. And these are unstable jobs because they are all tied with the global economy. And we have already seen two crises, big crises, 2 or 3 crises. So, but I think that is itself the thing, It's only through those kinds of, again, capitalist crises that social destabilization is beginning to happen. But whether destabilization can actually lead to positive change is another question, because destabilized conditions can lead in a fascistic direction as well. Right? So that's where we are sort of poised now, I think.
Are there a lot of migrant workers in India, within India? Because
My-
for me, the untouchable are the migrant workers in Europe. Like you put them in camps, you are not really
Oh,
You
yeah,
can
yeah.
try and, I mean, for
There-
me, that's the capitalists that want to create. They create this new untouchable, which are the migrants.
There is a lot of internal migration, but it's not caste defined.
But they are not in a social situation comparable to the untouchable. Because
The social situation maybe. No, economic situation is, but not social necessarily. Yeah, I mean, there are poor people among upper castes, so they will migrate in search of seasonal jobs, agricultural jobs during harvest season, planting season, etc. From Bihar they go to Punjab, lots of such migration. Nowadays, construction workers are going from any one place to any other place. There's a lot of construction labor. There's a lot of Dalit labor, untouchable caste labor within that. Yeah, but yeah, you're right. They tend to be restricted. But it is not the phenomenon of labor migration is not restricted to Dalits. It's there among all. So next week we are reading a young revolutionary called Bhagat Singh, who had a very short life, but in his short life made a very spectacular sort of impression and has become an icon again, and the next week's Bhagat Singh is something I would like to treat particularly as a modern icon. Somebody who has acquired a new profile, all kinds of new profiles in the contemporary situation. And there is also another reading, which is a story, which is Sadat Hasan Manto, who is a short story writer, who wrote some of the most brilliant short stories, a very controversial writer, many of whose stories were banned in India and in Pakistan, whose story, this is one of his most well-known stories, which is a story about partition. So we can discuss that story also next time.